systematically and persistently breaching legal limits for dangerous nitrogen dioxide pollution. It's ruled that since 2010, the UK has failed in its legal duty to put in place plans to tackle the problem as quickly as possible. The EU continued the case because it started before Brexit. Even once Brexit had happened, it continued. It's not clear whether the UK is going to have to pay any fines. Campaigners are warning the UK might be sort of weakening its stance on air pollution rather than strengthening it. But let's talk to a campaigner, Dr. Robin Russell-Jones, who's a consultant dermatologist by profession, but also scientific advisor to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Air Pollution from 2017 to 2021, and now environmental campaigner for 4 decades. Robin, let's just to start by explaining why we should care about nitrogen dioxide pollution.
Well, that's a good question. The really dangerous stuff is the small particulates, PM 2.5 and below, particularly the very small particulates, the nanoparticles, which are less than 100 nanometers. Those are the ones that really do the damage because they get across the lung into the bloodstream and they then reach every organ in the body and they get deposited in every organ in the body, apart possibly from the skeleton. But they get across the placenta, so they get into the placental tissue and the fetus. They get across the blood-brain barrier into the brain. So they get everywhere, basically. And they set up inflammatory reactions, and the cells suffer what's called oxidative stress, and then they misbehave, they malfunction. And that's why air pollution is associated with so many different health effects, from low birth weight babies all the way to dementia in old age. But NO2 is sort of slightly complicated because the Europeans don't think that NO2 is particularly dangerous. But of course, the reason that it's so highly correlated with health effects is because NO2 comes from diesel mainly. 80% of nitrogen dioxide in places like London is from diesel vehicles and diesel generators. And of course, diesel also produces the nanoparticles, which are particularly dangerous. So there's a very high correlation between NO2 levels and your exposure to nanoparticles, which are the things that kill people and so on.
So it's mainly diesel cars and lorries, yeah. I assume. What are the what are the other culprits?
Well, I mean, the DEFRA are desperate not to admit it's diesel. I mean, they made a fundamental, a catastrophic public health error when they promoted diesel in the 90s and early noughties.
But in terms of climate change, it was done, I mean, it might be the wrong thing done in your view, but it was done for the right reason, in the sense, in terms of climate change, they wanted to reduce the amount of petrol cars, didn't they? That was the theory.
That was the idea, but of course it was always nonsense. I mean, the benefit from diesel is marginal. And of course, when you take into the account it puts out oxides of nitrogen, and N2O, nitrous oxide, is itself a greenhouse gas, the benefit is negated, so it's nonsense. It was always a con, but the car manufacturers managed to fool the European politicians, particularly people like Peter Mandelson, into thinking that this was the solution to climate change, and it was always nonsense. No other trading bloc in the world went down the diesel route. I mean, in Japan, they started making, cleaner vehicles. In America, they stuck with gasoline. So Europe was the only one that experimented on their population by going down the diesel route. I mean, I knew in the late 80s, I wrote to the government's chief scientific advisor, Sir John Fairclough, because the Chancellor then wanted to introduce a tax break in favour of diesel. He didn't want to introduce a tax break in favour of unleaded petrol, which is what ought to have happened and did eventually happen. He wanted to introduce a tax break in favour of diesel. And I wrote to Sir John Fairclough and I said, look, diesel is dangerous stuff. It's 100 times more carcinogenic than a car running on unleaded petrol fitted with a catalytic converter. So we knew that in 1989, and despite that, the government decided they were going to go down the diesel route. I mean, it was a public health disaster, and it was negligence, frankly.
So in terms of air quality improving during lockdown, from last summer, particularly on Think Now, what did we notice then? Did we learn anything from that?
Yeah, well, what happened was because 80% of nitrogen dioxide comes from diesel vehicles, when people stopped driving their gas-guzzling, climate-changing diesel cars, the level of NO2 in London plummeted. I mean, it didn't go down as much as in other cities, because in other cities they hadn't taken any precautions against levels of, against diesel vehicles. I mean, at least in London, we've got the toxicity charge. So the falls in other cities was even more dramatic than it was in London. But, in London, the levels of NO2 went down, I think it was something like 50 to 60%. But then, of course, what they did was, coincidentally, a Lancet study was looking at rates of mental health problems in the population over the first 4 months of lockdown. And what they discovered was that levels of anxiety went down by 48%, levels of depression went down by 43%, and the level of self-harm went down by almost 38%.
Okay.
So getting rid of your air pollution from traffic has had a dramatic effect on the amount of mental health in the population.
Okay, well, we can't make that direct. We can't make that direct causal link. I mean, that's kind of circumstantial evidence in it. I mean, we can't attribute to those improvements you mentioned entirely down to the improvement in air quality.
No, but it's very interesting that everyone predicted that the incidence of these things would go up. I predicted it would go down with improved air quality, and it did go down.
But mental health issues have actually risen, haven't they?
Who says? Who says? I mean, what's happened is that we haven't locked down now. What's happening is that levels of NO2 are creeping up again. So the mental health problems are coming back.
Okay, so what's to be done then? There are also there's promises made to phase out all petrol and diesel vehicles within the next couple of decades, I think it is. Nothing can happen overnight. So do you want it to move even faster?
Yeah, I mean, basically, diesel vehicles are poison boxes. They're poisoning pregnant women and they're poisoning children, and they're reducing their IQ. If you look at the studies that were done in New York on non-smoking pregnant women, they looked at their exposure to a particular type of particulate called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and they found that the level of PAH in the blood, cord blood of the mother when at delivery, was linked to developmental delay at 3 years. It was linked to an IQ reduction of 4 to 5 points at 5 years, increased anxiety, depression, and attention at 6, 7 years, reduced amount of surface white matter in the brain at 8 years, and delayed self-regulatory behavior that was most significant at 11 years. So when you say there's no evidence of a causal link between reduced levels of air pollution and improvement in mental health, I'd say that's not true. There's plenty of evidence. It's just the British government have chosen to ignore it.
Okay, so in terms of the governance of this, obeying by the rules, post-Brexit, we set our own rules again. We've had Clean Air Acts in 1956 and 1968, before we were in the EU. So what is the legislation going to look like now?
Well, there isn't any legislation. I mean, that's the whole point. So the British government have been taken to court 3 times by Client Earth over illegal levels of nitrogen dioxide. They've lost every single time. The EU Commission are taking them to court and fining them. But of course, what the British government have done is not try to improve air quality. They've just left the EU. And then they brought in this environment bill, which is supposed to be world-beating. Well, it's world-beating in the fact that it hasn't got any air quality standards in it whatsoever. So
we'll have an office for environmental protection. So
not yet, we don't. It hasn't been set up.
Okay, well, once it's set up, then depending on on how big a stick they wield, then we'll see then.
Well, I mean, they will yield no bigger a stick than the Environment Agency, which is a government-appointed body that has presided over a dreadful deterioration in water and river quality over the last 5 to 10 years. So there's no reason to think that the Office of Environmental Protection will be any different. It'll be a government-controlled, funded organisation appointed by the Secretary of State at DEFRA. So it will have very little independence and very little clout, as has been pointed out repeatedly by everyone who's analysed the proposals.
Okay, thanks very much indeed for your time. That's Dr. Robin Russell-Jones talking about air quality.